Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Connor was sitting on the living room couch, feet propped up on the coffee table, mindlessly flipping through some work documents he'd brought home. It was an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day when routine seemed to flow without any surprises. Melissa was beside him, her face lit by the glow of her phone as her fingers scrolled across the screen with practiced familiarity. They'd been together for 5 years, married for 3, and that kind of comfortable silence was something Connor had always appreciated. It wasn't an empty silence, but the quiet assurance of two people who didn't feel the need to fill every second with words. The TV murmured softly in the background, some entertainment show neither of them was really watching. Connor looked up from his papers and made a casual comment about dinner, saying the pasta sauce had turned out especially good that night. Melissa responded with a distracted, without taking her eyes off the screen. Connor smiled to himself, used to this absorbed version of his wife whenever she got lost in social media. And then it happened. Still staring at her phone, Melissa casually said, "Brandon, can you grab me some more water?" The words came out naturally, without hesitation, as if she'd said them 1,000 times before, as if it were the most normal name in the world to call her own husband. Connor felt something strange run down his spine. It wasn't immediate, it took a split second for his brain to process what he'd just heard. He slowly set the papers down and turned to look at her. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, his voice more serious than he'd intended. There was no humor in the question, just genuine confusion mixed with something he couldn't quite name yet. Melissa froze. Her phone nearly slipped from her hands. Her face, relaxed just seconds earlier in the blue-tinted glow of the screen, lost all its color. Her eyes widened, and Connor could see raw, unmistakable panic setting in. She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again, like a fish out of water gasping for air. What did I say?" she stammered, though Connor knew she'd heard perfectly well. The tone of her voice, the slight trembling of her hands, everything screamed guilt. "You called me Brandon," Connor repeated, each word heavy. He straightened up on the couch, the work documents forgotten at his side. "Brandon? Who the hell is Brandon?" Melissa swallowed hard, and Connor could see her mind racing for an explanation. "Oh, sorry, I was just thinking about work. Brandon's a new colleague, we've got a big meeting tomorrow, and I was distracted thinking about it." The words tumbled out too fast, tripping over each other. She forced a laugh that sounded completely fake. "That's all, honey. You know how I get when work stress kicks in." Connor watched her silently for a few seconds that stretched like rubber bands. He'd known Melissa long enough to tell when she was lying, and every instinct screamed that her excuse made no sense. But he wasn't the kind of person to make accusations without being sure. That wouldn't be fair, it wasn't who he was. "All right," he finally said, picking up the papers again and pretending to refocus on them. But the printed words in front of him might as well have been in Chinese, because all Connor could process was that name, Brandon, and the way Melissa had frozen, the panic he'd seen in her eyes. The rest of the night passed in silent tension. Melissa went to bed early, claiming a headache, while Connor stayed in the living room, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince himself he was being paranoid. But something had shifted in that moment on the couch. A thin, almost invisible crack had formed in the foundation of trust he'd always taken for granted. In the days that followed, Connor began noticing things he'd previously overlooked. It wasn't that he was actively looking for trouble, but now that this seed of doubt had been planted, it was impossible not to catch the small details. Melissa checked her phone with obsessive frequency, and whenever he walked into the room, she'd quickly flip the screen over or close whatever app she'd been using. When Connor asked who she was texting, her answers were always vague: "Oh, just the girls from work," or "Nothing important, just silly stuff." Then there were the outings. Melissa had always been socially active, and Connor had never been the controlling type who questioned every move his wife made. But now he noticed that these girls' nights out had become surprisingly frequent. 2, sometimes 3 times a week, Melissa would get dressed up, put on perfume, and come home late, always with the same excuse that time had flown while catching up with friends. A week after the wrong name incident, Connor got home from work earlier than usual. A meeting had been cancelled, and he decided to beat the rush hour traffic. When he opened the apartment door, he found Melissa in the bedroom on the phone. She hadn't heard him come in, and Connor caught fragments of the conversation before she noticed his presence. "No, he doesn't suspect a thing. I know, I was careless. I'll see you tomorrow at the same place." Her voice was low, almost a whisper, layered with an intimacy that made Connor's stomach twist. When she finally turned and saw him standing in the doorway, the phone nearly flew out of her hand. "Connor. You scared me," she exclaimed, her voice 2 pitches higher than normal. "I didn't hear you come in." "I noticed," Connor replied, keeping his tone neutral. "Who were you talking to?" "Sarah, we were making plans to go out tomorrow," Melissa answered too quickly, already slipping the phone into her pocket. Connor said nothing, just gave a slight nod, but they both knew something was off. That night, after Melissa fell asleep, Connor lay awake in the dark, listening to her steady breathing beside him. He didn't want to be this kind of person, he didn't want to become someone who invaded his wife's privacy. But doubt was eating away at him like slow, persistent acid. He needed to know. He needed to be sure he was losing his mind, that his imagination was conjuring problems where none existed. With careful movements, Connor slid out of bed. Melissa didn't stir. He picked up her phone from the nightstand, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure she'd wake up just from the sound of it. He knew the password, he always had. Melissa never kept secrets from him, or at least that's what he believed until a week ago. The screen lit up his face in the darkness, and Connor began scrolling through her apps. WhatsApp first. He skimmed through recent conversations, looking for something, anything, that would confirm or dispel his suspicions. The chats with her friends seemed normal, full of harmless memes and gossip. Nothing there stood out. Then he saw it. An archived conversation. The name, Brandon. Connor felt the air rush out of his lungs. With slightly trembling fingers, he tapped into the chat. What he found hit him like a punch to the gut. Messages dating back months, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. These weren't messages between co-workers discussing meetings or projects. They were messages between lovers. "I can't stand pretending when I'm with him," one of Melissa's messages read. "When I'm with you, I feel truly alive." Connor kept scrolling, each message cutting deeper like a sharp blade. There were photos, selfies of the 2 of them, wide smiles, intimate embraces. There were, "Good morning, love," texts and, "Already missing you." There were detailed plans for meetups, always on days Melissa claimed she was out with her friends. One message in particular made Connor fight back the nausea rising in his throat. "My marriage to Connor is just for convenience now. I'm waiting for the right moment to end it. But you know it's you I really want." Connor read that line 3 times, as if the words might change meaning on the 4th. Convenience. 3 years of marriage reduced to one cold, cruel word. He thought of all the nights they'd spent together, all the future plans they'd made, every time he'd said, "I love you," and she'd replied the same way. All of it, a lie. Or at least, a lie to her. He kept reading, unable to stop even though each message felt like tearing off a piece of his own skin. There were conversations about where they met, always discreet hotels during lunch hours. There were discussions about their future, about what they'd do once Melissa was finally free from her marriage. Brandon talked about trips they'd take together, apartments they'd rent, plans for a life that didn't include Connor in any way. The most devastating part was discovering how long it had been going on. Not weeks, months. 6 months, to be exact. Half a year of Connor's life lived in a lie, while his wife built a parallel life with another man. 6 months of false I love yous, empty kisses, and total pretense. Connor returned the phone to the nightstand and went back to bed, but he couldn't sleep. He lay there staring at the ceiling, feeling Melissa's weight beside him like something suffocating. The woman he loved, or thought he loved, or loved the version of her he believed was real, was sleeping peacefully while his world quietly collapsed. For the next 2 days, Connor went through the motions on autopilot. He went to work, came home, chatted with Melissa about trivialities, all while feeling like he was watching his own life from outside his body. He needed a plan. He needed more concrete proof. But above all, he needed the courage to face the truth he'd uncovered. On Thursday night, Melissa mentioned she'd be going out with her friends on Friday. Connor just nodded and said it was fine, that she should have fun. Melissa seemed relieved by his lack of questioning, which only confirmed everything Connor needed to know. Friday arrived, and Connor left work pretending everything was normal. Melissa was getting ready when he got home, wearing that blue dress he'd always said he loved. She smiled at him in the mirror, carefully applying lipstick. "Won't be out too long," she said. "I'll probably be back around 11. "All right," Connor replied, mechanically kissing the top of her head. "Have fun." After she left, Connor waited exactly 15 minutes before taking screenshots of every conversation, every photo, every piece of evidence he needed. He emailed everything to himself and saved it all on a flash drive he kept in a secure place. Then he waited. Melissa got home at 11:30, just as promised, her hair slightly tousled and that familiar sparkle in her eyes, something Connor used to think came from a fun night out with friends. Now he knew it was the glow of someone who'd just been in another man's arms. On Saturday morning, Connor woke with crystal-clear clarity about what he needed to do. He made coffee, cooked pancakes, and acted as if it were just another ordinary weekend. Melissa seemed relaxed, even happy, probably relieved that Connor wasn't asking questions. It was during lunch that Connor finally broke the silence that had been suffocating him for days. They were sitting at the table, Melissa chatting about something she'd seen on social media, when Connor simply placed his phone on the table, the screen showing a photo of Melissa and Brandon hugging. "So," he said, his voice surprisingly calm, "how was your night out with the girls yesterday? Or should I ask how it went with Brandon?" Melissa froze mid-bite, her eyes locking onto the phone screen like it was a snake about to strike. All the color drained from her face, leaving her ghostly pale. Her fork slipped from her hand, clinking against the plate. "Connor, I can explain," she started, but her voice came out as a choked whisper. "Explain?" Connor repeated, and now there was an edge to his voice, his forced calm beginning to crack. "Explain 6 months of lies? Explain how you built an entire separate life while I was here, like an idiot, believing every word you said?" He unlocked his phone and started scrolling through the screenshots he'd saved. "Explain these messages saying our marriage is just for convenience? Explain how you've been planning to leave me for him? Explain how you look me in the eyes every day and say you love me, when you're really thinking about him?" Melissa started crying, tears streaming down her face in torrents. I'm so sorry," she sobbed, her words broken and uneven. "I didn't want it to be like this, I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did," Connor said, and for the first time, his own voice cracked. "You destroyed me, Melissa. 6 months. 6 months looking at me, kissing my lips, sleeping in my bed, while you were with him. How could you? How did you live that lie for so long?" Melissa shook her head, unable to form coherent words between sobs. Connor waited, letting the silence press down on them like a tombstone. Finally, she wiped her face with trembling hands and said something Connor never expected to hear. "I'm pregnant." The words landed between them like a bomb. Connor felt as if the floor had been ripped out from under his feet. "You're, what?" "Pregnant," Melissa repeated, her voice small and shattered. "I found out 2 weeks ago. And I don't know. Connor, I don't know whose it is. The whole world seemed to stop in that moment. Connor looked at the woman across from him, the woman he'd promised to love forever, the woman who now carried a child that might or might not be his, and felt a whirlwind of emotions so intense he couldn't separate one from another. Anger, pain, betrayal, confusion, all swirling together into something devastating. "Get out," he said, his voice surprisingly steady despite the chaos inside. "Get out of my house. Now." "Connor, please, we can talk this through," Melissa pleaded, reaching out toward him. "We can figure this out, we can." "No," Connor cut her off, pulling away from her touch like it burned. "There's nothing to figure out. You made your choices. Now I'm making mine. I want you out of here by the end of the day." Melissa tried to argue, tried to beg, but Connor remained unmoved. He left the room, locked himself in the bedroom, and listened as she gathered her things between sobs. When he finally heard the front door close, Connor let himself collapse, the full weight of everything hitting him like an avalanche. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal procedures and raw emotions. Connor hired a lawyer, filed for divorce, and demanded a paternity test as soon as it could be done during the pregnancy. Melissa had temporarily moved in with her mother but was in constant contact with Brandon, who apparently was willing to take responsibility regardless of the test results. The paternity test was done at 14 weeks via a non-invasive procedure that analyzed fetal DNA in the mother's blood. Connor waited for the results with a mix of hope and dread. Part of him wanted the child to be his, because even after all the betrayal, the idea of being a father still stirred something in him. But another, more rational part knew it would be cleaner, easier, if the child wasn't his. When the results arrived 3 weeks later, Connor read them alone in his now silent apartment. Brandon was the father. He reread the documents several times, as if the words might change, but they remained the same. Surprisingly, what Connor felt was relief, a clean break. No permanent ties to Melissa, no shared custody complications, no having to see her for the rest of his life. Melissa moved into Brandon's apartment shortly after the test results came back. Apparently, he'd taken responsibility seriously, talking about marriage and raising a family. Connor heard this through mutual friends and felt only distant indifference. It was no longer his problem. The divorce was finalized before the baby was even born. With no children in common and no complex shared assets, the process moved relatively quickly. Connor kept the apartment, and Melissa took her things. They never saw each other in person during the whole process, everything was handled through lawyers. 3 weeks after Melissa moved in with Brandon, Connor heard through a mutual friend that things weren't going well. Apparently, the reality of living together and facing an unplanned pregnancy was very different from the fantasy they'd built during their affair. There were constant arguments, about money, about space, about unmet expectations. The friend mentioned that Melissa looked exhausted and regretful, the spark in her eyes completely gone. Connor listened to all of this with a kind of quiet poetic justice. It wasn't that he wished her harm, not exactly. But there was a bitter satisfaction in knowing her fantasy had shattered against the wall of reality, that what she'd thrown away wouldn't be replaced by something better, but possibly something much worse. He didn't respond when the friend asked if he wanted more details. He simply thanked her for the information and changed the subject. Because the truth was, Connor was genuinely moving on. Not in the sense that he'd found someone new or fully healed from the betrayal, but in the sense that he woke up in the morning and could breathe without that crushing weight on his chest. In the sense that he could go entire days without thinking about Melissa or Brandon or that whole nightmare. Connor had started therapy soon after the divorce, something he would have once considered unnecessary but now recognized as essential. He was learning to trust again, to rebuild the self-esteem that had been shattered by the betrayal. He was learning that what Melissa did said nothing about his worth as a person or partner, but everything about her own choices and character flaws. He started investing time in himself, in hobbies he'd neglected during the marriage. He returned to playing basketball with friends, something Melissa had always complained took time away from them. He began cooking more elaborate dishes, experimenting with recipes he'd always wanted to try. He took his first solo trip, a spontaneous road trip that gave him a sense of freedom he hadn't felt in years. A few months after the divorce, Connor was sitting in a cafe when he saw a social media notification. Melissa had posted an ultrasound photo, announcing the baby's gender. He stared at the image for a long moment, expecting to feel something: pain, anger, resentment. But all he felt was a quiet sadness for what could have been if she'd been honest, if she'd respected their marriage. Then he closed the app and went back to the book he was reading. Connor's life wasn't perfect. There were hard days, moments when loneliness weighed heavily, and he found himself wondering if he'd ever be able to trust someone again the way he'd trusted Melissa. But there were also good days, increasingly frequent, when he felt grateful he'd discovered the truth when he did, grateful he hadn't wasted more years of his life in a lie. He was in the process of healing, slow, but steady. He was learning that betrayal says more about the traitor's character than about the flaws of the person betrayed. He was learning to set clearer boundaries, to trust his instincts, to not ignore red flags out of fear of seeming paranoid or controlling. One night, nearly a year after the separation, Connor was sorting through his things when he came across an old photo of him and Melissa on their wedding day. They were smiling, radiant, full of hope for the future. He looked at that younger version of himself and felt deep compassion. That man didn't know what was coming, he didn't know the woman beside him was building castles of lies around him. But Connor also knew that this experience, as painful as it had been, had transformed him. He was stronger now, wiser, more aware of his own worth. He'd survived what felt like the end of the world, and emerged not just intact, but in some ways better. Connor tucked the photo into a box at the back of his closet, alongside other memories that no longer served him but weren't quite ready to be thrown away. Then he returned to his life, to his quiet apartment, to his peaceful nights, to a future that was finally his alone. Because in the end, Connor learned the most important lesson of all, that someone else's betrayal doesn't define who you are, it only reveals who they always were. And that sometimes, losing someone you thought you loved is actually gaining the chance to find something much better, starting with self-respect and peace of mind. And Connor was at peace. Not completely, not yet. But he was on the right path, and for now, that was more than enough. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.